In early October 2022, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia helped slash oil production by 2 million barrels a day, or a reduction of 2% of the world's total oil supply. This manipulation caused international oil prices to skyrocket, creating a major increase in revenue for Russia's war effort. This has turned US and Saudi relations upside down. It's been seen as a shock for Saudi Arabia to seemingly out of the blue betray their unofficial friendship with the United States like this. So why is Saudi Arabia becoming closer allies with Russia, and what impact could it have on our national security? We'll start with the country's background. After the fall of the Ottoman Empire in World War I, Saudi Arabia united behind the descendants of the dynasty, and the modern nation was born. You see, during King Saud's 1945 meeting with US President Roosevelt, the two bonded over their shared physical ailments. Nothing like two guys becoming buddies over complaining about back pain together. This conversation would set the course for these two nations for decades to come. Roosevelt and King Saud came to an agreement where Roosevelt agreed to provide diplomatic and military training to the upstart country in return for access to Saudi Arabia's vast oil reserves. The best bromances are always mutually beneficial. Oil companies began swarming Saudi Arabia, bringing enormous amounts of wealth with them to the fledgling government. They lucked out with the draw of the resources on the settlers of Catan board. Today, Saudi Arabia has a population of 35 million people, and it's the largest country in the Middle East, located directly in the center of the Arabian Peninsula. Along its 830,000 square mile territory, it borders UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Iraq, Jordan, Yemen, and Oman. From 1993 to 2010, they were the world's largest oil producer. Most oil production in the nation was actually originally done by American companies. Later in the 20th century, by the late 1970s and early 1980s, Saudi Arabia had regained ownership of most of the oil production by buying out these foreign companies. Even though they had this high level of cooperation, the United States and Saudi Arabia often clashed over international incidents. The first event occurred in 1973. This was when Saudi Arabia was one of the first countries to leverage their oil production as a weapon against the West. This had never really been done effectively before, a move that has had reverberating consequences all the way to this day. During this time, the United States and other Western nations supported Israel in their fight against Iran and Egypt during the Yom Kippur War. President Nixon at the time agreed to send $2.2 billion in weapons assistance to Israel. This led to Saudi Arabian King Faisal leading a boycott of oil exports to the US from October 1973 to March 1974. A global recession ensued from the infamous gas shortages. High inflation and price hikes occurred due to this in America in the 1970s. The price of gas soared by 40% in November of 1973 alone. By this time, Saudi Arabia was one of the world's largest suppliers of oil, and this move was able to almost single-handedly cripple the American economy. US-Saudi relations did manage to normalize again during the 1980s due to rapid economic and technological expansion, but America would make energy independence a top priority going forward. But Saudi Arabia at the time gained generally favorable opinions by most people in the West, and we'll see why. In the 1990s, when Iraq invaded a small country of Kuwait, Saudi Arabia was quick to call upon the assistance of the United States for military protection. They feared an Iraqi attack into their northern oil fields. A US-led coalition responded with Operation Desert Shield. The United States used Saudi Arabia as a staging area for Operation Desert Shield, which would push Iraq out of Kuwait and back over their own border. The best way to describe the US and Saudi Arabian relationship is with this term that you hear called realpolitik. It's kind of a German word for realistic politics. It means engaging in diplomatic policies that are based primarily on considerations of given circumstances and factors rather than strictly binding yourself to explicit ideological notions or moral and ethical premises. So this relationship has been based on practical, economic, and security considerations, even though the ideological position of these two countries couldn't be more different when it comes to things like democracy, women's rights, political prisoners, freedom of the press. Realpolitik reminds me of a term that us average infantrymen have too. We like to say, it is what it is. Now, modern-day Saudi Arabia is currently run by their King Salman and his son, the Crown Prince/Prime Minister Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud, who handles most economic and diplomatic roles. It's really incredible how much power this guy has. It's important to note that Mohammed bin Salman is a major reason why the relationship with the US and Saudi Arabia is changing right now. This guy is consolidating power and leaning towards authoritarian forms of government. The royal family of Saudi Arabia have had near absolute control over all aspects of government, and they've had the ability to make unilateral decisions to enact any policy they see fit. Despite the United States having a history of not really taking a liking to kings and monarchies in general, in 2021 alone, the US and Saudi Arabia traded around $24 billion. And they've had a constant rotation of US military personnel, about 3,000 soldiers at any given time inside of Saudi Arabia. All of this in spite of gross human rights violations in Saudi Arabia, including Saudi authorities failing to hold high-level officials accountable for their involvement in taking out the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018. On the other hand, there is often a cold calculation to geopolitics where humanitarian violations take a second-place consideration to larger global stability. Realpolitik at it again. It is what it is. Now, in response to Saudi Arabia's actions, many US lawmakers are claiming that decreasing oil production in the midst of the conflict in Ukraine is a geopolitical microaggression against the US. It's also been interpreted by President Biden as political manipulation by the Saudis of the American midterm elections in favor of the Republicans. Saudi Arabia claims that the politics has nothing to do with it, and in some ways, I think they might not be lying. If you look at their profit numbers, you can see their reluctance to sanction Russia has a lot to do with economic incentives that are at play here. For instance, the Saudi Arabian oil company Aramco reported on November 1st, 2022, they had earned $42 billion in the third quarter, which is 4 times higher than their numbers at the same time in 2020. $18 billion from that will be paid as a dividend straight to the Saudi Arabian government. We might have generally good relations with Saudi Arabia, but we're not the only ones in there shaking hands with the king. They are well known to have strong relations with both Russia and China. Why is that? Well, for starters, China is the world's biggest importer of Saudi oil, because Russia and Saudi Arabia combined control just over 20% of the world's oil production. You'll see them working together in order to control market prices. But there's an elephant in the room. All these countries are oppressive, authoritarian dictatorships of some kind. So what's pushing these countries closer and closer together? A revolution in America. The shale revolution. Looking at American oil production reports by the U.S. Energy Information Administration, there has been a major rise in production over the past 10 years. The shale oil boom that started in 2006 in the United States changed everything. New fracking technologies allowed the U.S. to reduce its reliance on foreign oil markets by doubling production from a low point of less than 7 million barrels a day in 2007 to nearly 18 million barrels a day by 2020. The US had surpassed Saudi Arabia as the world's largest oil producer. This decreased Saudi Arabia's influence and was a major threat to their oil-based economy. It's naturally led to a decrease in imports from Saudi Arabia, and as of August 2022, imports are now as low as they've been in 30 years. Of course, since Saudi Arabia's entire economy is based on oil production, you can see why they would seek to strengthen their relationship with Russia as a trading partner and China as an oil importer. There are always unintended consequences to every move. By reducing reliance on Saudi Arabian oil to reduce the risk of weaponized oil, the United States may have inadvertently created an incentive for Saudi Arabia to create closer ties with Russia and China, although the incompatible ideologies of these two countries are also pushing them apart. But we're forgetting one thing that has kept these two strange bedfellows, the United States and Saudi Arabia, in bed together up until now. The United States has overwhelmingly been Saudi Arabia's primary military partner throughout history, with consistent troop rotations there since the early 1990s. Part of what has kept the Saudis' relationship warm and fuzzy with the United States has been major arms sales. America made up 37% of global arms exports during the last 5 years, and guess who accounted for a quarter of those sales? Saudi Arabia. Every US president from Obama to Trump and Biden, all of them have supported massive arms sales to Saudi Arabia. During Obama administration between 2011 and 2015, Saudi Arabia was the destination for nearly 10% of all US arms exports. Saudi Arabia signed billions of dollars of deals with US companies like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman. All of this in spite of the fact that the US State Department report found, quote, Saudi donors and unregulated charities have been a major source of financing to extremist and terrorist groups over the past 25 years. The report goes on to state that Saudi Arabia was a place where Al-Qaeda raised money directly from individuals and through charities, and indicates that charities with significant Saudi government sponsorship may have diverted funding to Al-Qaeda. The United States, of course, looks past this because it is what it is. Not many people realize just how important that defense support from the United States is to Saudi Arabia. They've consistently been ranked #1 as the highest percentage of GDP spent on defense year after year. In 2015, they spent $87 billion, or 18% of their GDP, on their defense, an insane proportion when you consider most countries, including the US and China, don't break 4%. So why the high spend, Saudi Arabia? Their real worry comes from Iran, its largest military threat, which is located just across the Arabian Gulf. They're a major balance of power against Iran. The primary mission of the US troops stationed in Saudi Arabia gives some insight into this. They've been providing high-tech missile defense along Saudi Arabia's borders, a very important mission that has been actively intercepting incoming ordnance from Iranian-backed militias and terrorist groups. Saudi Arabia, being at odds with Iran because of religious and economic reasons, has pushed the Saudis into the arms of the United States defense industry. At the same time, US troops are training Saudi Arabia's own military and building up their capabilities. The largest imports from the United States have typically been complex military equipment such as the American F-15 fighter jets, Patriot missile systems, and vehicles like 400 of the M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. It's looking like the Saudi dependence on US military equipment might be beginning to change though, which could further upset the balance of power. In September of 2021, Russia and Saudi Arabia signed a military cooperation agreement, which was aimed at increasing the number of Russian military trade and manufacturing between the two nations. Russia agreed to sell $3 billion worth of equipment to the Saudi kingdom, which included manufacturing rights to the Cornet missile launchers, MLRS, automatic grenade launchers, AK rifles, and ammo. And in some regards, from Saudi Arabia's point of view, it makes sense to be besties with Russia. They appear to be holding many of the same values in collaboration with each other, including a strong preference for authoritarian forms of government. This appears to be more evidence of the world splitting along authoritarian and democratic lines, hopefully not to be a setup for World War III. Finding a way to cooperate with countries that you despise to the very core is a part of what has prevented World War III up until now. The Saudis signed this deal with Russia for military equipment right as the US had announced that they would be withdrawing 8 of its Patriot air defense systems and THAAD anti-ballistic missile systems for the region. While the agreement with Russia ended up fizzling out, further talks discussed the purchase of more complex equipment such as ballistic missiles, air defense systems, and Su-57 fighters. But why is Saudi Arabia looking to get this Russian equipment if it isn't as technologically advanced as the US equipment? One of the big reasons is due to its war in Yemen. Saudi Arabia is attempting to fight off the Iranian-backed Houthi rebel groups in Yemen. The civil war in Yemen has been a humanitarian nightmare, one that the US has distanced itself from due to the heavy civilian casualties inflicted by Saudi Arabian-led airstrikes. The United States sells military equipment and ammo with strings attached, and that string is a severe limit on how and where the weapons are used to ensure no civilians are hurt. Russian arms sales, however, don't have these strings attached. Saudi Arabia sees their weapons not only as a way to conduct the war against Yemen rebels as they see fit, but also to begin their own export of manufactured military goods. This is a luxury not afforded by US military contracts. This follows a trend of the crown prince seeking out cooperation from Russia, while his father, the king, typically favored the United States over other nations. The king gave up the title of prime minister to his son, the crown prince, just this September, further giving him the ability to separate Saudi Arabia from American dependence. All of this leads us to where we are today. Saudi Arabia has only increased their friendship with Putin and has had questionable reactions to his invasion of Ukraine. Analysts explain the most Arab nations, Saudi Arabia included, view the conflict in Ukraine as, quote, a complicated European conflict which does not require Arab states to stand against Vladimir Putin's government, and that Arab statesmen do not believe their government should burn bridges with Moscow because of this conflict. Because of this, Saudi Arabia hasn't placed any sanctions on trade with Russia, which only increased trade as Russia quickly ran out of trading partners after the invasion. Since the start of the war, Saudi Arabia Kingdom Holding Company has invested $500 million into Russian companies like Gazprom, Rosneft, and Lukoil. There have been no efforts to hinder Russia's ability to wage war, though, which is to the disapproval of the West. Saudi Arabia, along with Turkey, did, however, help facilitate prisoner exchanges of almost 300 individuals between Russia and Ukraine. Speculation into Saudi motives sends two messages. The first is that Saudi Arabia is not controlled by the United States despite their military cooperation, and second, that they are adamant to preserve their relationship with Russia, specifically regarding the oil economy, which brings us to the recent falling out between Saudi Arabia and the United States. Since the move to lessen oil production and the resulting falling out between the US and Saudi Arabia, the White House has stated that it will need to, quote, reevaluate its relationship. Many US government officials called for the United States to completely pull troops from the kingdom, as well as the UAE, a fellow OPEC member, as a response. A bill proposed by House Democrats would require the redeployment of all troops and missile defense systems and reallocation to other nations in the area. You might be thinking the US has troops all over the world, who cares if they pull them from one location? But it's actually a much bigger deal than you might think. On November 1st, 2022, it was reported that Saudi Arabia had informed US intelligence agencies that there was an imminent attack from Iran. Iran currently is in the midst of intense civil unrest, with violent protests spreading across the country, which Saudi Arabia believes provoked Iran into planning an attack on the kingdom in order to distract their population, blaming Saudi Arabia for orchestrating the protests. In response, the United States placed all troops in the area on heightened alert, with the National Security Council putting out the statement that, quote, we are in constant contact with military, diplomatic, intelligence channels with the Saudis. We will not hesitate to act in the defense of our interests and partners in the region. This implies that while high-profile talks between heads of state might indicate a breakup of some sort, the reality is that below the surface there is still tons of cooperation happening at lower, arguably even more important levels. Realpolitik at it again. It is what it is. Saudi Arabia's consistent threats with Iran really show how complicated the international situation truly is. Though Saudi Arabia is militarily aligned with the United States, they're aligned with Russia economically through OPEC cooperation. On the other hand, Iran is military aligned and supported by Russia. If Saudi Arabia is on good terms with Russia, Russia is able to influence Iran into not directly invading Saudi Arabia, an invasion which, due to American military presence, would likely spark a war between Iran and the United States, which, due to military alignment, could then pull Russia into a war with the United States. It's like a game of 3D chess, I think, maybe. I barely know how to play 2D chess. From all the information available, it's unlikely that the US will totally pull out from Saudi Arabia for a couple of reasons. The first is that by defending Saudi oil fields from attacks from Iran, Houthi rebels, and terrorist groups, it guarantees a stable oil supply in the region, which helps stabilize the world oil market and prevents American domestic gas prices from skyrocketing. What America loses in tax dollars spent to protect Saudi Arabia, it gains in political influence and economic certainty. Secondly, the US doesn't want to lose the geopolitical advantage of having military capabilities and freedom in the largest and most economically powerful country in the Middle East. The US relies on Saudi intelligence for information on what's going on both militarily and politically in the entire region, which has helped feed American international policy. If the US loses military influence in the region, Russia and China have already expressed interest in taking America's place. Because the United States conducts what it calls great power competition, basically fighting over international influence against Russia and China, it's not in the interest of international policy to lose this partnership with Saudi Arabia. The fact that Russia and China are unlikely to fill the security role by the United States provided to Saudi Arabia, it's potential proof that relations between the US and Saudi Arabia are hopefully going to normalize again over the next few months and years. This isn't the first time there have been tensions and emotions thrown by these two countries, and it's unlikely to be the last. But both nations still have some mutual interest in cooperation economically and militarily. And for the sake of world peace, this is hopefully unlikely to change anytime soon. Even if we would prefer to throw out realpolitik and only choose our allies who align with our values, sometimes it is what it is. Today I just released our first members-only exclusive content. It's an interview that I did with a Serbian sniper who's fighting for the Russian army, and he gives us all of his insights as to what happened when he first invaded on the Kiev front into Ukraine, and then what it was like to retreat from there and then go and fight in the east again on the Izium front. So if you're interested in that interview and more monthly members-only content that I'm going to be creating, then join up today if you want to be a part of the Spare Parts Army.